to tell us need to know and want to know about beavers?
Maybe.
Okay, go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming out on a beautiful fall day. It seems like those are kind of rare sometimes, but been getting some really nice weather here, which won't pass up. But my name is Tyler Brown. I'm a wildlife biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. My primary responsibility with the department is overseeing the Beaver Wetlands Conservation Project for the state. We're going to get into that. But I essentially I work statewide, working with towns, landowners, road crews, anybody who's having issues with beavers. And the goal of our project is to, when possible, maintain beaver-created wetland habitat for the benefits of a lot of fish and wildlife species, but also people. So this evening, we're going to talk all about beavers, the benefits of having beavers on the landscape, the challenges that they can create, some of the biology, the management, and the history of beavers in Vermont. Before we get started, just in case you're not familiar with the work that Vermont Fish and Wildlife does, our mission here at the department is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitat for the people of Vermont. And when you think of the department and the work that we do, most people are familiar with us stalking trout or managing deer with the black bear population. We do so much more than that. We work through monitoring our natural communities, monitoring invertebrates, plants, and then one of the most important things that we do is managing and protecting habitat, because without healthy, connected habitat, we're not going to have good, healthy wildlife and fish populations. So who do we serve? We serve everyone, all Vermonters. That includes our hunters, our trappers, our anglers, our wildlife watchers, our communities like we are today, our landowners. We work a lot with private landowners because private land is majority of Vermont is privately owned. So if we want to influence and maintain and protect wildlife habitat, we have to work with our private landowners to do that. And we also do this work for our future generations, which I think is pretty serious. I want to make sure that we have good, healthy wildlife populations for our future generations.
If anybody can't see, feel free to your chair into the open.
Yep. And if you run out of a drink and need to go get one, feel free to get up, or food. I won't be angry if you get up in the middle. So please help yourself. But beavers. Beavers are an awesome animal. On land, they're a pretty clumsy animal. They're humpback. They've really evolved for life in the water. And they don't venture all that far from the water. They're usually going to stay within about 100 yards of the water's edge. And again, they're really well adapted for life in the water. When they're in the water, they are more of a torpedo shaped. They're really good at swimming. They have large hind webbed feet that can propel them through the water. And then that tail, that big flat tail, acts as like a rudder for them to swim. They have transparent eyelids that act as swim goggles. When they dive underwater, those eyelids will close and they can kind of see underwater a little better. It protects their eyes from sticks and other vegetation. When they dive underwater, their nose and ear channels or canals automatically close, so they're not ingesting any water. And then one of the coolest facts or little tidbits about beaver that I think is cool anyways, is that they have fur-lined lips. So we have hair around our lips, but beavers actually have hair on their lips. And I don't know any other mammal that has that. I think that's just kind of a cool and interesting thing about beavers. Beavers are rodents. So they have front incisor teeth that are continuously growing. And that's one reason why they're always chewing, is to keep those teeth short but sharp. And then their molars are pretty flat, and they use those for finding tree bark. And that's primarily what they're eating, is the bark of trees. And it's going to be your deciduous trees like your maples, willows, alders, aspen or poplar. pretty much a lot of the trees that are growing in riparian areas is what they're gonna prefer. They will occasionally chew down conifers, like white pine, spruce, or hemlock, but for the most part, they're sticking to those deciduous trees. And in the summertime, they'll also eat vegetation like leaves, sedges, grasses, lilies, and cattail roots as well. But also, if you look at a beaver skull, I was talking about how well adapted they are to life in the water. When you look at a skull, the top of it is very flat. So when they're in the water, their head just needs to stick out and the rest of their body can be underwater. Their eyes sit pretty much right on top of their head. I know most of you are eating, but I will pass around some of this stuff. So if you want to just kind of skip by, you can. I'm not worried about it getting gross or anything like that. I want you guys to be able to handle this stuff if you're interested. This is kind of just showing how good beavers are at chewing down trees. I set up the trail camera here when the tree was just started to be chewed on, and I think it's probably within about a week the beaver had actually toppled that tree. It was probably maybe a 12 DPH tree, something like that. But again, this is right on that water's edge, so it can kind of jump back into the water pretty quickly if it senses danger. Beavers live in a family group called a colony. That colony is going to be made up of 2 breeding adults and then multiple generations of kits. When those 2 breeding adults, they will have, for example, kits from this spring. Those kits will stay with their parents for 2 years. So then this next spring, they'll give birth to another like 2 to 6 kits. And then both generations will spend that next winter with them. And then at that spring of the 3rd year, when those kids from the first year are 2 years old, they get kicked out to disperse and find their own territory. And they'll go further upstream or downstream to find the next available habitat.
How many fit in lodge?
It all depends on how long the beavers have been there. So the lodges start out fairly small and we build them out bigger and bigger as the longer they've been there. A typical beaver colony is around 6 beavers, 2 adults, and then a couple of kits from each generation. But it's not uncommon to have 10 or more beavers in a lodge. So a lodge or a bank den is where beavers spend most of their time. They're actually pretty cool. So they'll have multiple levels to their lodge. They'll have a lower level where they'll bring in sticks and feed. And then the upper level is actually where they'll raise their young. They'll build almost like a little nest in that upper level. They'll bring in grasses and sedges. And that's where they're raising their young. They're really well insulated. They're usually made up of a foot or more of mud and sticks. And there was a researcher, I believe it was in Anchorage, Alaska, that looked at the temperature outside and inside the beaver lodge. And they recorded the inside temperature in the middle of winter inside a lodge to be around, I think it was 33, 34 degrees. And that was with the outside temperature being 50 degrees below 0. So it's incredibly well insulated. Beavers are a pretty decent sized animal, so they can kind of produce heat and it keeps all that air inside nice and warm. And all lodges are going to have some kind of air vent at the top. So one way to determine if a beaver lodge is active in the wintertime is to look at the top of that lodge, because that air is going to exchange from the outside and inside. So when that warm air kind of escapes from the top, it'll freeze when it hits the cold air and form like ice crystals. So it's one good way to know if there's at least something living inside a beaver lodge. And during the winter, they rely on a underwater food cache to be able to survive. So right now we're in the fall, they're preparing for winter. They are really busy cutting down trees and creating this food cache. So when their pond freezes over completely with ice, they're actually completely trapped under the ice. They can't get out onto dry ground other than inside their lodge. So in the wintertime, they spend the majority of it inside that lodge, and then they're just going to dive down into the water, grab a stick, bring it back, eat it, and that's how they spend their winters.
She had a quick question, but she wanted to know how long they can stay underwater.
Yeah, beavers can hold their breath for around like 15 minutes at a time. So beavers are able to convert each breath they take, they are able to convert that to usable oxygen really well. So humans, when we take a breath, we can convert that to about 15% usable oxygen. Beavers can convert it to about 75%. So it's really good exchange rate. So they can hold their breath for around 15 minutes. So beavers are territorial. So they're going to defend that territory. But like most animals, they try to direct conflict with one another because when you come in direct conflict, there's the risk of getting injured and potentially being. So one way they do that is by building castor mounds. And a castor mound is simply a pile of mud built at the edge of the water. And then they're secreting castoreum on that mound, that pile of mud. And that's allowing or letting any other beavers in the area know that this area is occupied. You should move on and find your own place to live. They also use that castoreum and other oil glands to prune and waterproof their fur. So they'll secrete that into their hands or even their hind feet and work that into their fur. And that's one way they can keep their pelt nice and waterproof. Beavers have a unique hind foot where they'll have their normal claws kind of come over the top, but then on their third digit, or what would be our ring finger, they'll have another claw that comes off to the side, and they can use that to prune their fur, clean their fur, and work that oil into their pelt. But beavers have an incredible pelt. It's incredibly warm. They have long guard hairs that help protect and waterproof a really dense underfur, and that underfur will stay dry even if their guard hairs are wet, and it helps trap air against their skin and keep it very, very warm. So again, I'll pass this around if people want to handle it. Don't worry about getting it dirty. I want people to be able to.
The average beaver weight, an adult.
Yeah. I would say it's probably around 30 pounds. Yeah, they can get much bigger. That 60-pound beaver is not all that uncommon. They're pretty hefty animal. That pelt there is probably from a average size beaver that was probably around 30 pounds. But yeah, they can get pretty big. So you've probably heard the term keystone species. Anybody know what that term means? Or have you heard it before? See some head nods. Yeah, so a keystone species, in this case of beavers, beavers create habitat that other wildlife and fish species depend on in some portion of their life cycle. So beavers are really creating habitat for a lot of wildlife species. And beaver dams are really that can help jumpstart the base of the food web. So when beavers build a dam on a stream, they're increasing the productivity of that water. So they're going to slow that flow of water. They're capturing a lot of nutrients in that system, and it's going to help increase the abundance of plankton, phytoplankton, zooplankton, your macroinvertebrates, like your aquatic insects, and then all that can help feed the fish that live in there. And then you're going to have your songbirds that are nesting in the willows and the alder thickets that are often in these areas. You'll have a ton of different waterfowl and amphibians and reptiles that are all using this area. And then you'll have your otter and your mink and herons and kingfisher that are all coming in and feeding in on those amphibians and fish. And then, of course, you'll have your moose using these wetlands as well. And these wetlands are really are aquatic filters for us. So again, they're absorbing a lot of water. They're helping capture sediment, hold it further upstream rather than have it just wash downstream. And when beavers build a dam in a stream like this, they're helping reconnect that stream with its floodplain. So they're raising that water level up, allowing it to spill its banks over into the floodplain, which can actually help reduce downstream flooding. Because otherwise that water is just funneled in that stream, picking up momentum and velocity downstream, which can cause more erosion, more flooding as it works its way down. The beaver created wetlands are cyclic. So what I mean by that is beavers move into an area, they'll build a dam, usually a series of dams, and then they're going to live there until they deplete that food source and they're forced to move on to a better location where there's more suitable habitat. When beavers abandon that site, they're no longer maintaining that dam, so it'll hold back less and less water over time because those dams are pretty porous, especially when beavers aren't putting new mud on it. Every day, beavers are packing new mud, filling any little holes that the water's filtering through. So when they abandon that site, it'll dewater, and all of that sediment that was under the water is now exposed to the air and oxygen, and it usually greens up very quickly, and it can look something like that photo there. And that creates this inactive beaver flowages, create a lot of good habitat for a lot of species. It just kind of slightly shifts from when beavers are active in that. So in the springtime, areas like that are often one of the first places black bears will go to because there's usually not a lot of food for them when they first come into hibernation. So they're relying on that green vegetation. So again, it's one of the first places that has food for bears in the spring. And later on in the spring, and later on in that cycle, when that vegetation gets a little thicker, you'll have your deer that give birth in those areas because it's a good place to hide fawns. And then you'll also have a lot of rodents living in there. And then with the prey base, you also have your predators like your bobcats, your coyotes, and even your bears that are going to be hunting in these areas looking for the next meal. So we got to take a step back now because to really understand where we are today with our beaver population and management, we need to understand where we came from. So beavers in particular were always and are still always in demand because their fur is really unique, it's really versatile. As you feel it, it's incredibly soft and warm. It's uniquely suited to felting. So if you've seen like the Stetson hat or even like cowboy hats, they're actually made from beaver fur. So it can go through a process of felting and they can make a naturally waterproof hat. And in the last few years, beaver prices have actually gone up in price. And part of that is actually related to, if you've watched the show Yellowstone, they're wearing cowboy hats. Those hats are all made from beaver, and people found out about it and were like, "Oh, we want a cool cowboy hat." So it's actually shown that it caused beaver prices to go up because there was a little more demand for it, which is kind of interesting. And it wasn't just the fur from beavers that could be used. The meat is actually really good. If you've never had beaver meat, if you have an opportunity to, I would encourage you to try it. It's actually really good meat. And they're relatively easy to catch. So in most of Europe, by the end of the 1300s, the completely unregulated take of beavers and other fur bearers pretty much extirpated beavers from the landscape. And back then, the more pelts you had, the more fur you had, the wealthier you were considered. So that's kind of why people wanted to have as many pelts as they could, because the more you had, the wealthier you were considered. And with no regulations saying how many you could catch, any time of year restrictions, it really depleted a lot of resources during that time. So fast forward a little bit, when Europeans first landed to the New World, Native Americans were kind of still stuck in the Stone Age. They were still using bone awls, skin kettles, flint knives, where the European tools were vastly superior to what the Native Americans were using. And when they became aware of this, they wanted those tools that they had, and fur became essentially their currency for their way of getting those tools. And this really created this whole system of trade to go about that. So, for example, 10 beaver pelts could buy 1 gun. 1 beaver pelt could buy either a ½ pound of powder, 4 pounds of shot, a hatchet, 8 knives, or a pound of tobacco. So it created this really efficient system of trade. And with that, with no regulations, it started to deplete the resources in that area. And that's what really pushed the exploration further west. And again, it was that demand for fur that created this reason to explore further. And this efficient system of trade, no regulations, again, habitat change as well, which we'll get into in just a second, decimated a lot of native species as people moved further west. So looking more specifically at Vermont, Vermont went from about 90 to 95% forest to about 30% forest by the early or mid 1800s, excuse me. So with that, with the complete habitat change during that time, it really influenced or impacted what species could live there. We lost a lot of our iconic species like our white-tailed deer, our turkeys, black bear, fisher, marten wolves, Atlantic salmon. It all disappeared during that time because we completely altered the landscape in addition to unregulated take. There were no regulations. Beavers, on the other hand, had already been gone from the landscape about 100 years prior to that. So we started to build a lot of our infrastructure, our roads, our railroads, with no beavers on the landscape. A lot of that was all built with nobody thinking about what's going to happen if there's a beaver here with this culvert, or maybe we shouldn't put this road through a wetland or paralleling a stream. How many of our roads follow or intersect some stream in Vermont? Probably say almost all of them at some point. So in Vermont, we have around 15,000 road miles and over 116,000 culverts or bridges. And that's only including public culverts and bridges. That doesn't speak on all of the private driveways that have culverts and other bridges there. So if you were to kind of overlay these two maps, you can see that the area of conflict is potentially very high when we have beavers on the landscape. And in 1910, we officially awarded beavers protection because we understood early on that having beavers on the landscape could mean that we have healthier wildlife populations. So, and then following that, in the 1920s and 30s, we actually began to translocate beavers from remote areas of New York and Maine, bring them back to Vermont, and release them here to kind of reestablish a population. I believe the first 2 reintroduction sites were over in Peacham, down from Peacham at this point. I'm always used to saying up in Peacham. But down in Peacham and then also in Bennington. So after those reintroduction efforts, we wanted to know how well beavers were doing. So we started to do surveys to try to estimate their population. And in 1941, we did a survey revealing around 400 beavers located in most counties in Vermont. We repeated that survey in 1944 and estimated there to be around 1,100 beavers established throughout the state. And then we repeated that survey again in 1949, estimating the population to be around 8,000 beavers. So you can see how quickly that population grew. And the reason why it did so well was because our land use was again changing during that period of time. A lot of our farms, our agriculture was shifting during that time. So a lot of farm fields were being allowed to kind of grow back up into young forest, which created prime beaver habitat. And it was unoccupied. There was no competition from other beavers. It was kind of wherever beavers wanted to go, they have the available habitat to do so. So shortly after that, in 1950, we actually opened up the first 15-day regulated trapping season for them because complaints and conflicts had already started to rise, and we needed a way to resolve some of those conflicts. So during that 15-day trapping season, we estimated the harvest to be around 1,100 beavers, which just 6 years prior was the estimated population. So again, it really just shows how quickly that beaver population grew. So I talked about, or I mentioned that our land use was changing, so there's a lot of good habitat. But along with that, we didn't have our natural predator, or our native predators like wolves, to kind of keep the population in check. So really, it's our licensed trappers that can help control populations in certain areas. And some recent numbers, our harvest is around 850 beavers during that regulated trapping season, which runs from the fourth Saturday in October through the end of March. And 35% of that 850 are caught for doing damage. So damage could be anything from beavers chewing trees, plugging culverts, flooding somebody's lawn, somebody's septic system, anything like that. And then we have an additional around 600 beavers that are removed outside of that regulated trapping season for doing damage.
What does that process look like?
For trapping outside of the season. So Vermont has a state statute that allows landowners to protect their property from doing damage. So landowners are allowed to protect their property. So if a beaver or the statute says rabbits or fur-bearing animals, if they're doing damage, they have the right to protect it. So as long as they're doing damage, they don't need any special permit to do that. But we really want to encourage people to have beavers caught during the regulated trapping season, because that means they can be utilized. So it's in the late fall through the winter, that pelt is going to be prime. It's going to be really thick fur. It can be used by the trapper. They can utilize the meat, and so we just want people to value the beaver. So if they can be caught during the season, they can be utilized. And I'll pass these around too. So those are some mittens. Beaver fur, in my opinion, is some of the warmest fur out there. It's incredibly versatile, naturally waterproof. They'll keep you incredibly warm. And we currently have a really abundant, thriving beaver population throughout the state. I can't drive more than a few miles in any direction without seeing some evidence of beavers, which is really, really cool to see. But with that, as the beaver population continues to grow, alongside our human population, conflicts are on the increase. And because we recognize the important value beavers have on the landscape, we've been kind of working with folks to keep that value as high as possible. So we've been trying to resolve conflicts when possible. We have found through doing this work and just general work throughout the state that people really value wildlife until it starts to create problems for them and cost them money. When it starts to cost them money, they just want the problem gone. So if we can kind of keep that value of wildlife as high as possible, that has everybody's interests in mind. So in 2000, we created the Beaver Wetlands Conservation Project. And as I mentioned early on, this project is designed to work with landowners, towns, and road crews who are having issues with beavers. The goal being to maintain beaver-created wetland habitat when possible. And we can do that through the installation of some water control devices, which we'll get into in a little bit. In 2002, we wrote the best management practices for resolving human beaver conflicts in Vermont, or what I like to just call BMPs, because it's a lot quicker and a lot easier to say. But this document discusses beaver biology, management, techniques for resolving conflicts, and then some of the regulations surrounding wetlands. And our funding for this project, it's currently through a grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That helps pay for my time to do site visits, to do outreach like this. And then we also get funding from the Vermont Duck Stamp Fund, which helps pay for materials when we decide to build a device. And we ask landowners or towns or whoever we're working with to contribute roughly 50% of the materials or the cost of materials that we use if we decide to build a device. That just helps extend our funding a little more. And it kind of has the landowners of the towns have some skin in the game, so they're going to kind of care about these devices, and it's not just a free service. It varies greatly depending on exclusion fence, beaver baffle. So it ranges quite a bit.
From the simple to the complex.
Yeah. We'll get into it here in just a second. But yeah, so I cover the whole state of Vermont, working with everybody. Conflicts range greatly from beavers chewing trees to plugging culverts, flooding roads, flooding backyards. The list is quite long. One of the more common calls that I get is beavers that have moved into somebody's man-made or backyard pond, and that they're creating an issue, whether they're chewing trees or plugging the outlet. In those situations, I can provide advice over the phone, but since our funding for our project is geared toward maintaining beaver-created wetland habitat, we're not really doing any work when beavers are in somebody's backyard pond, because they're not beavers. If you remove the beavers from the site, we're not like losing wetland habitat. So in those situations, if somebody wants the beavers to be in their pond but can't have them causing damage or whatever they're doing, there is a private individual as his own business here in Vermont as well, called Beaver Deceivers. So they could work with that gentleman to resolve their conflict at those sites. Yeah.
Could the tail be used?
Yeah, so people, the tail of a beaver is pretty much just fat. So people can eat the tail, they can kind of roast it, and it's almost like steak grizzle. So it's fatty. It's not bad. I've had it a couple times. And then you can also use the tail itself and have it tanned, and you can have it as like leather. Yeah. So some of the common conflicts that we deal with are the overwhelming majority is public and private infrastructure. So that's going to be culverts under roads is the common one. That's actually over 70% of the complaints that I go and see are related to public and private infrastructure. Flood concern takes up another big portion of it, but that's kind of a catch-all that I use where it doesn't really fit into any other category. So, for example, that could be a landowner has a beaver dam on their property, and they're concerned that it's going to break and wash out a portion of their property downstream. Or it could be the reverse, is that they have a beaver dam on their property, and they're concerned that it's going to back up the water and start flooding their lawn or septic or something like that. So take a step back. I get around 400 calls and emails related to beavers. So I'm pretty busy. It's starting to wind down now because beavers have kind of established their territory. They're just starting to cut down a lot of trees at this point. Which again, that's actually a really easy thing to resolve. If people don't want the beavers to cut down their trees, and it's just a small number of trees, there are ways to protect those trees during that time. So usually we're not getting too involved with those conflicts either. But based on the site visits that I do and the conflicts, where our recommendations for those sites, again, vary greatly depending on that particular site. A third of the time is when we're recommending installing an exclusion fence or a beaver baffle. So it is limited where those devices work. And again, I'll dive into what a beaver baffle is and exclusion fence is in just a second, but it's a relatively small percentage of the recommendations I make. Monitor situation is kind of similar to flood concern. It's like a catch-all where beavers may not really be creating any problem at that point, or maybe the activity needs to shift slightly for us to step in and do something. But that's a good portion of my recommendations. And then trapping beavers during the regulated season makes up about 20% of the recommendations. All right, so now we'll kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of the work that I do. So exclusion fences are a device that's going to be built at the inlet of a culvert. The idea being that it prevents the beavers from getting access to that culvert and allows them to kind of go further upstream or downstream, have their wetland, but it keeps that culvert functioning as it's intended. So it's really relatively simple to build. We use cedar fence posts, some 2x4s, and then the paneling for the fence is something you can get right at Tractor Supply. They call it goat feedlot panels. Comes in a 16-foot length. It's about 4 feet tall. And then the important part of it is that the mesh size or the openings for it is 4 square inches. So that's small enough to keep beavers out, but it's still big enough to allow some debris to get through, some smaller reptiles and amphibians and fish to squeeze through. I often build it in kind of a trapezoid shape, but I think it's doesn't always depend on the shape of the fence. But what does, I think, matter is the beaver activity at each site. So I've had most of our success or the highest success rate when the primary beaver activity is upstream away from the culvert. So in both of these photos, there's a beaver dam upstream of the culvert. That's where their primary beaver activity is. So that's where they're going to have their lodge and spend most of their time. And then they've just been coming down to the culvert to plug it, to flood the area, to get better access to the trees on the bank.
I got a dumb question.
Yeah.
Why is it that they work, so why is it that they're necessary up front, at the top, but they don't plug the downstream end?
Yeah.
Why don't they try that?
Just the way beavers build dams, so they're facing with the current.
Into the current.
And I think the velocity coming through the culvert is just too much for them to really.
Nothing to dig into.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, the way beavers build dams is they're facing with the current, working downstream. Sometimes they'll go just below the outlet of the culvert,
It will.
and they can build a dam there and back it up through. But for the most part, they're building at the inlet. And the reason they're building, or why culverts are such a challenge with beavers, is that the beavers are smart, honestly. They're using the road as the dam, and the culvert is just a small hole in the dam that they need to plug. So rather than build a 100-foot dam, they just have to plug a 2-foot or 3-foot culvert. So they work smarter in that sense. And also, it's the sound of running water that triggers beavers to build dams, and culverts are often amplifying that sound. So it kind of just beckons the beavers to go to that site.
Okay, there's my thought.
Yeah. So just some more examples of exclusion fences we've built. I've gotten into the habit of building, installing what we call a beaver baffle into that fence. And the reason being is that if the beavers decide to dam around the outside of the fence, that baffle can limit how high the beavers dam on it. So if they were to place debris or dam around the fence, it would raise the water level up a little bit, but then it would reach the inlet of the pipe and start flowing down through. The idea being it would limit how high the beavers could dam up on it. It's only necessary if the beavers dam around the fence, and it's really hard to predict if they're going to or if they're not. It's just one of those things I've just gotten in the habit of doing that, and it just acts as a insurance policy.
How long did they last?
Yeah, it depends on the site and how active the beavers are. Sometimes you'll get, I'll show you in a second, they may last a couple weeks. Other times they may last a couple years, or you'll have a big flood or something wash them out. We do have several sites throughout the state that I just recently, in the last 4 years, rebuilt. They were built when the program first started in the early 2000s. We rebuilt some because the wood just started to rot. So in the right situations, these can last a really long time. But it can be kind of tricky determining that right location. And this kind of speaks to what you're saying. These fences do not work in all situations. Water volume is probably the biggest factor that can kind of limit how successful these devices are. Water depth, the substrate, the site layout, and then beaver activity also all factor in. But this particular site here, I spent the better part of a day with V-Trans building an exclusion fence at a culvert, and within a week, there was water over the top of it. And what was challenging about this site was, like, again, most of our roads, it goes right through the middle of a wetland. So you have wetlands on both sides of the road. And probably when this road was built, the downstream side of this culvert, it was ditched paralleling the road. It was fairly narrow before it opened up into the bigger wetland. So it was really easy for beavers to build a dam in that drainage ditch. And that's what they did. They just went downstream from this culvert, plugged that drainage ditch, backed up water through the culvert and over the fence. So again, it's all these kind of like little nuances at each site that kind of factor into how successful these devices are going to be.
Was there a fix for that?
My recommendation was to do some trapping and kind of help control the beaver populations. They were so active at that site that, like, and that's part of the challenge, is that you could go and install a beaver baffle in that dam, in that drainage ditch, but then the beavers would just build another dam downstream, and then you just kind of keep going down through. So yeah, it's can be challenging for sure. So beaver baffles are the other device that we can install at some locations. This is a device that's going to be installed at a beaver dam. And the idea is that it can help control the water level in that beaver pond and limit how high the beavers are raising that water level.
Get a touch on that?
Yep.
Like, how fast
Don't
they-
worry. Don't worry. I'm not just going to throw a little bit and be like, oh, that's all I'm telling you. So we have kind of two primary different designs of baffles that we use. I've been really sticking to rectangle baffles because I found that they're a lot more durable. They're actually made of the same material that lobster traps are made out of. So it's a kind of a powder coated wire mesh, comes in a big roll, 2 feet tall. We'll cut the panels to 5 feet long, and then we'll get 12-inch dual wall pipe, preferably drill a bunch of holes into it and stick it inside that cage. And then we'll connect a bunch of pipe length together and install it through the dam. Round baffles, I still use occasionally because they're nice in locations where the water is deep or you have a lot of sediment where that cage will sink in over time. The problem that I've run into on a couple of occasions is that the way I build those cages, and it's the same material that I use for the fences, it's goat feedlot panels, but I roll that panel up into a cylinder, and if the water chemistry is just right, I've found that since you're putting stress on the welds, that they can actually rust and kind of bust open, and you'll have the cage kind of fall apart over time. It's been relatively limited of when that happens, but it's kind of a pain in the butt when it happens. So whenever possible, I'm using rectangle baffles, and I'll also build, using the goat feedlot panels, just a square baffle. So instead of bending it into a cylinder, I'll just cut the panels and attach it as a square, and that works pretty well as well. So the way the beaver baffle works is that you will carve a notch into the beaver dam. You'll carve that notch to the depth that you want to lower the water level, and then you'll connect all your pipes together. And you want that cage to be a minimum of 30 feet away from the dam. 40, 50, even 60 feet away is probably best, because if that cage is too close to the bottom of the dam when the beavers are making their repairs during the night, we'll just incorporate that cage right into the dam. So you need to get it pretty far away to kind of be discreet so the beavers aren't able to figure out what's going on. And the idea, again, is being that we're sneaking water out of their pond and down below without them knowing how to stop that flow of water. So when this is all installed, you really do not see anything. That cage will be dropped off the back of the boat. It'll set on the bottom, completely underwater. You'll sink the pipe, so water will enter the pipe at the cage, flow through, and then down the back side.
Don't brace the pipe down at all.
I'll put cinder blocks on.
Okay.
I'll take like 2 big cinder blocks with a wire, and that kind of helps hold it down. It can be kind of tricky at times to push all the air out of the pipe, so sometimes I'll drill holes to allow air bubbles to come up through.
You have 10 interns at the bottom trying to siphon it.
Keep them there, all that, yeah.
Oh, do you guys
No, I haven't had that be an issue, and I think it's just the velocity of water that's coming out of the pipe that And it's a pretty long distance, so they can't really like see light all the way through. So I don't think they'd really feel comfortable doing that. But that's a good question. I'm glad they don't know how to do that. It would make my job a lot harder. I always get a kick out of this video. This was a beaver baffle that I installed several years ago now. And I put these sticks here and crisscrossed them to help hold the pipe down. But the beavers have already back and dammed or repaired the dam in front of pipe. What they're doing right now or trying to do is stop the sound that they're hearing. So they're hearing the water flow through the pipe down the backside. So they hear that sound. Dragging sticks down the backside trying to stop that sound. Because normally they're just going to stop right here. They don't need to dam here because that's not doing anything. They're not stopping the flow of water. But
time annoyance.
I know. I just get a kick out of that video to see them to do that.
They moved into the quiet neighborhood and then you came along.
Yeah. But we'll usually extend that pipe around 10 feet below the dam. If we can get the outlet of the pipe underwater, that can kind of cut down on the sound and works really well.
Oh, okay. So you can buffer.
Yeah, it's not always possible. It's site dependent on when we can do that, but it does, I think, help if you can do that.
Sure.
So after the installation, again, the idea is that the baffle can maintain the water level at a lower level and reduce whatever or resolve the conflict that they were creating. Landowners do need to have some level of tolerance for the water to, or some level of tolerance for the fluctuation in water level, because when it rains, that water is going to rise, and then it may take a couple of days or several days, depending on the watershed size, for that water to drop back down. So there needs to be some level of tolerance for the water level to come up and down. And then similar to exclusion fences, water volume, water depth, site layout, and then beaver activity are kind of all factors that determine how successful these devices can be. And it is limited where these are going to work because we're based on how much water we can move with an 8-inch or maybe a couple of 12-inch pipes. But in the right spots, these are a really good option for folks. And then with like most things, they require maintenance. For exclusion fences, I usually recommend once or twice a year, clearing any debris that accumulates around the fence. And then with beaver baffles, I recommend, again, once or twice a year, lifting the cage up off the bottom just to shake out some of the mud that settles into it. Because if it doesn't, over time, it'll settle into the bottom, into that mud. And then once that sediment gets inside the pipe, it'll clog it up and it'll no longer work.
What's your budget like for operations?
So yeah, we have a database, so I keep track of all of our devices. I try to check on them like every other year if possible. You're just like, have you seen my presentation? You're like one step ahead of me every time. It's really, I don't know. Can you see the screen?
No. Judging your, I guess I'm feeding.
It's perfect.
He's hooked.
So since we started the project in 2000, we've installed, this is actually slightly outdated, I haven't updated it yet, but we've installed just over 350 devices throughout the state, influencing over 3,800 acres of wetland habitat. We currently have around 100 devices that are still continuing to function. And you may look at that number and be like, well, why is there such a big difference? Why have you installed 350 but only 100 are functioning? There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they don't always work. Sometimes we get it wrong or beavers just kind of get really active. Yeah. Exactly. But also beaver activity changes over time, right? So if we install a beaver baffle at a site and it may work perfect for the time that the beavers are there, but when they abandon that site, we'll actually go in and salvage that material and reuse it at other locations. And I've found through my work that the baffles don't really work all that well if you install them before beavers are there, or if you were to leave that in place. Because when new beavers come back in, they may build the dam in a new location and prevent that baffle from working. And also, you have vegetation that grows through the cage. So we'll salvage that material so we can use it elsewhere. And we install around like 10 to 15 devices throughout the state, both beaver baffles and exclusion fences. And from our functioning devices that we have, we're continuing to influence around 1,200 acres of wetland habitat. So then I like to end on this slide. Wildlife management is complex, and there's reasons for that. So I took a course in college that was the Principles of Wildlife Management, and I think there were, I don't know, 12 different principles that were all listed out. And the one that I really only remember is wildlife management is simple, people management is hard. And it's very true. Because you have differing opinions, you have different goals between everybody, so it can be kind of hard to navigate that. And no single solution can resolve all conflicts. So what works here may not work here. What works here may not work here. And a comparison I try to make, and I don't know how well it works, but one I always say is like an auto mechanic or a car mechanic. They may have a car come into their shop and it may only take a couple of tools to fix that car. They may have another car come into their shop and it may take another set of tools to fix that car. That mechanic is going to want to have a whole toolbox of tools available to them to be able to fix any problem that comes into their shop. And it's really the same thing when we're talking about human beaver conflicts. Beaver baffles, exclusion fences, and trapping are all tools to resolve conflicts. And again, what works here may not work here. So a beaver baffle may work perfect at this site, but it may not work here. So maybe you need to trap some beavers at this site, or maybe an exclusion fence works over here, but not here. So having all these available tools to us is really important to effectively manage human beaver conflicts in the state. So that's all I have for you. I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any. Yeah. Good question. I don't know. So we don't have the way we manage the beaver population and fur bear populations in general is through trends. So we don't have like a number or a population estimate on beavers. We get it through population trends over time, and we get that information from our licensed trappers. So they're required to submit information on how many animals they catch, how many or how long they were trapping for, so how many traps they had set, and the number of traps they had, how long they had set, and then the watershed management unit that they were trapping in. And from that information that we can get catch per unit of effort, and then from those numbers we can develop population trends over time. So in Vermont, the beaver population's, I would say, just slightly above stable and actually still increasing. And I think partly too, I can compare that to how many calls I'm getting each year. If the population starts to go down, I would anticipate the number of calls that I get to kind of go down.
You mentioned too, different types of lodges, like there is I forgot what you call it, like a lodge or something like that.
Yeah, like
Are those like what you see on the side of the lake?
Yeah, yep. So we'll call those like bank dens. So yeah, beavers will have like your stereotypical beaver lodge that's kind of out in the middle of a pond. They're able to do that kind of when they create their wetland, when they're building a dam. But if they're living in a lake or even like a bigger river, like the lower Winooski or Otter Creek, they'll actually burrow into the bank, and sometimes they'll build kind of their lodge like sloping off into it. And that's just because that's what they have available. They're not able to build a lodge like out in the middle of the lake because it's too deep of water. Yeah. Yep. Yep. I've never had that happen. I've had a couple of spots where we'll clear a culvert and you drop that water level and it like impacts their lodge. It draws the water, so they'll kind of come and swim back and forth and investigate you. I actually have a video. I might have to add it to this presentation where the water level was dropping and I was starting to build a fence, and there was a beaver that was actively bringing in mud trying to replug the culvert. But they're kind of curious, and when they're in the water, they feel really safe. So they can get kind of close to you, swim back and forth, and then they'll smack their tail on the water that I'm sure you see. I think they do that one to try to scare off whatever it is in the area, but then it's also like a warning signal that to other beavers in their colony. They'll smack their tail, be like, "Hey, there's danger in the area. Just beware," type of thing.
Isn't otters lodge beavers lodge?
Yeah, so otters don't build their own lodges, but they actually will use abandoned beaver lodges, or they'll use like a bank or a den inside a bank. And then black bears will even hibernate in abandoned beaver lodges when obviously there's no water there. They'll burrow. Yeah.
Do beavers make latrines?
They no, so they're gonna defecate in the water, but the comparison I guess would be like their castor mounds.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of like a communal area.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. No, we don't allow for the relocation of wildlife in Vermont, specifically for beavers. There's many reasons for it. One is because we have such an abundant beaver population that there's really no place to put them, that they couldn't create an issue for somebody else. Or since beavers are territorial, you can't just release a beaver into an occupied beaver habitat because it'll get kicked out or even killed. And then it's going to have to kind of venture to its own place to find an unoccupied site. And it could die of starvation or exposure or predation during that time. There's also concern that we could unnaturally move disease or an illness across the landscape. So if we were to live trap a nuisance beaver and move it 20 miles or 50 miles to another location, if that animal was sick, it's spreading that disease unnaturally through the landscape, which we wouldn't want to do.
Okay.
Okay.
And, there's always been lots of talk about the beavers and their activity there. And we do have some big dens built either on the bank or in the river. You worked at the Little River at all in doing any trapping, or do you know of any trappers that will that have worked there to control the beavers?
No, I don't. That would probably be a good thing to get in touch with your local game warden if somebody's having a specific issue. We as a department don't offer trapping as a service, so we don't go out and trap. We were going to refer them. Yeah, so we have biologists that kind of keep track of that. I'm only going to go out to the site if beavers are actually creating an issue. If beavers aren't an issue, I'm usually not getting involved. But yeah, the Willoughby River would be a tough one, just from my basic knowledge of it, because of the water volume that flows through it. So I don't think it would be a good site or a good candidate for like a beaver baffle to resolve a conflict at that site.
So one of the reasons that I came here was because my husband and I own a piece of property that borders the Willoughby River, and it's in a section that always has overflow because of the dams.
Yeah.
And told that of course it's creating wetland, so that's an issue. But what I really wanted to try to figure out was a way to reclaim our property. And was there a way to build something, maybe some plantings, or what can a landowner do to have more control and stop the growth of the benefit?
Yeah, it can be a challenge, and my recommendations vary greatly depending on each individual site, so it's hard for me to speak specifically there. But yeah, in certain situations, to stop a wetland from expanding, a beaver baffle in some spots is an option because it can prevent it from growing. Working with a licensed trapper to control the beaver population in that area is another option. And then, like you had mentioned, making sure we have good, connected, healthy riparian areas and floodplains that can allow that water to disperse is good. So doing plantings can kind of help with that.
We're here for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, you can work with different organizations to do that work. And then the sister department to Fish and Wildlife, DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, they have folks in the wetlands program and wetlands program and rivers program that can help and advise on like what you can and cannot do in wetlands and things to mitigate certain issues with them.
Do trappers work? So they take it, you don't have to pay them, the landowner doesn't have to pay them, or?
It's gonna depend. So if a trapper is doing like animal damage control outside of the regulated season, I think they often charge a fee because they're not getting any value or any money, or they're not really able to use the pelt during that time because it's not prime. But then during the regulated season, you may be able to work with a trapper that will do it free of charge because they can utilize the animal during that time. Yeah. I think it's around like I'm gonna get it wrong. I think there's around like 1,200 licensed trappers. I think around like 600 to 800 of them are actually like active in trapping.
Is that trapper certified?
So that would be a licensed trapper. Yeah. So
So you
somebody
have a
who's
trapping card.
so somebody who's gone through trapper education, gone through the training to be able to purchase a license. Yeah. Yeah.
And did I understand? If on your land, or personal land, out of season or whatever, eliminate?
If they're causing damage, so they have to be causing damage.
And does that have to be reported or submitted?
No, you just got to be able to prove that they were causing damage.
So if they're making their wetland grow, I could, and there's a dam nearby my property, I could dispose of them.
If they're causing property damage. I talk to your local game warden, because they're the ones that are enforcing regulations, so I would have a conversation with them for sure.
And there's a handful around here, one in Holland, one in Derby, one that lives in, I think, Albany as well. So you got a whole, and another couple in Morrisville, you got a whole suite to choose from.
Yeah, you're in Willoughby, you said? I think it's outside of Randy Hazard's area. Will Seegers, I don't think covers it. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's maybe Cody, yeah. Okay. Another question? Yeah.
When the kids are basically kicked out of the lodge,
Yep.
how far away from their family?
Yep, good question. It's always going to be based on habitat availability and suitability. So if it's really good habitat nearby that's not occupied by other beavers, they'll likely set up shop right there. The males will probably travel a little further in search of a mate, but it's all based on suitable habitat and available habitat.
They only follow the water systems up and down.
For the most part, the rivers are kind of like roads for beavers, so they'll follow watersheds, but they will jump watersheds. They'll travel a distance. I've heard reports of beavers kind of like working their way over a hill to get into the next watershed. But for the most part, they're sticking to water. Yeah, waddling back and forth. Yeah, but for the most part, they're sticking pretty close to water. Yeah. Yeah, they'll build a dam in like the mainstream of the river, and once that starts flooding, they'll build like little canals to get better access to the food. Because again, if they can flood that area up in there and swim there rather than travel across the land, that's what they're going to do. So yeah, it is pretty amazing what the work that they can do.
Residents, how long can you keep? Does the beaver stay if you say you have like a early successional forest?
Yeah.
And how long can you keep them there longer beyond the 5 years?
Yeah.
7 years?
It all depends on food. So so once they deplete that food source, they're going to move on, and it may shift. Like they may just kind of work their way upstream, or maybe work their way downstream. They may not just totally abandon the site and go miles away or something. But yeah, it really depends on on the food source. And again, they're staying within around 100 yards of the water. So like there'll be some sites where I've seen the beavers have been so active there over time that it's almost like a hard line where like you have pretty much no food and then you have like mature trees, and that was kind of like their cutoff point. And yeah, that cycle, it could be every couple of years or it may take longer. It's completely dependent on food. You know, so it can be kind of hard to you can kind of look at it and be like, yeah, they'll probably be here for another couple of years. Or maybe like, yeah, there's food everywhere. They're going to be here for quite some time. Any question? Yeah.
My neighbor was telling me a story about, beavers are trying to build a dam on his property, and when it rained, I think it might be surprised, but they would get like their dam break on that.
Yeah.
Do you see that very often?
It does happen. For the most part, beavers are building in low gradient areas. So really 4% stream gradient or under is where they're going to try to occupy. We'll see beavers kind of take advantage of low like drought times or low flow times a year and build dams in like bigger rivers. But then once you get a heavy rain, it kind of just pushes it out. But yeah, beaver dams can definitely break. They do break. And unfortunately, we hear about the ones that break and cause property damage, but we don't hear about like the tens of thousands of beaver dams that are on the landscape that kind of complete their cycle without creating issues. So it can be a challenge because also like our land use is overlapping with good beaver habitat. So really the best way to avoid flooding damage in these areas is to make sure that we have good connected floodplain areas and that we're not building in those floodplains, which is again challenging because we did that historically without the knowledge of we shouldn't be building in a floodplain because we could have a lot of damage and cost us a lot of money in the future. But we're learning there and we're starting to do a lot better for sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, when can you get up to see the site?
Sure. Get my email?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
We are called News and Brews, and it's MWA's News and Brews, so Patrick has some news.
And
about
Gabby.
What we're doing.
Yeah, we're gonna talk to you for a few more minutes. I don't want to keep you locked in your seat. Feel free. If you need to go to the restroom, you need to hit the bar or the buffet. We just want to show some example projects that we've been working on recently related to this. So give me a second while I get my act together. There we go.
Yeah.
I think this is working.
That's okay. Yeah. How fast? Like, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it depends on how wide.
Okay.
Yeah.
As Mary Pat mentioned, my name is Patrick Hurley. I'm project manager with MWA. I'm joined by Gabrielle. She's a project coordinator with MWA. And we're going to show a few example projects. You had that little clicker somewhere? Oh, there it is. That we've been working on. I hope that thing goes away.
Oh, if you might have to do presenter view.
Presenter view? Oh, this is just PDF though. Hide, loading media. There we go. Okay. Get out of here, you punk. Okay. So yeah, there we go. We got it. Come on. There we go. Delayed. I want to start by thanking Henry Coe, person standing next to truck. This is why AI is the end of us. So we have a couple of beaver conflict resolution projects. Henry Coe here, next to his beautiful 1992 Toyota, was kind of the spearhead of some of the work we did in Albany on Seaver Brook. Henry came to us coincidentally last winter and said, we are getting some momentum with the town highway department and some landowners who have some beaver conflicts. And he was seeking some support for some non-lethal solutions. That was a lot of S's, so I really slowed down there. But Henry did a lot of legwork. He talked to the select board, you get the pulse on how they would feel about doing some of these projects. He got landowners on board. He went out and February took pictures of the snow to try to give me some idea of where we're talking, which was helpful. And then he really just coordinated a lot with the human dynamic, as Tyler said, which can be the trickiest part. So I don't see Henry here, but just want to give him a shout out. Thanks, Henry. So Henry brought us out to South Albany, which I've lived in Orleans County for 3.5 years now. And every time I go to Albany, I still continue to get lost. But this is on Hartwell Pond Road. And it's a project that is a pretty big drainage area. It's over a mile square drainage area. It drains Hartwell Pond. It's kind of the headwaters of Seaver Brook. And there's a 3.5 acre beaver complex up there. And this pipe was actually big. It was a 6-foot pipe. But this beaver dam, there's a whole complex, couple series of dams. On occasion, the beavers would get ambitious and they'd clog the pipe. On occasion, one of the dams would breach and all the debris would clog the pipe. On occasion, the ice jams mixed with the beaver activity would clog the pipe. So they were looking for some solutions. We reached out to Tyler for some technical assistance. Like, we want to implement a beaver conflict resolution project. This angel investor private foundation had approached MWA and asked us to spend some time working on beaver conflict resolution. So we actually had money to offer to landowners who came to us looking for help. So it was like really a match made in heaven. So here, Gabby and Ted, right here with the laser on them, from Orleans County Conservation District, got out there in the early spring once the snow melted, got us some drone imagery. We're dealing with this road crossing right here. You can see big, beautiful wetland complex on the upstream side, Seaver Brook going downstream. And so we got together and we built one of these cage protection or inlet protective cages. Tyler is referring to exposures. So this is a little bit of a different take on the same sort of structure. We have a big 2x4 frame with a epoxy coated wire mesh cage around it. We went with 6x6 squares, which hopefully will work. But we have a big beefy 18-inch bypass pipe. So the whole purpose of this is the 6-foot pipe was adequately sized for this drainage area, which was the first check. Like, we're not going to invest our time and energy to protecting a pipe that is the wrong pipe. If it's too small, if it's undersized, if it's poorly aligned, if it's just structurally incompatible, we're going to say, no thanks, we're not going to help you on this. The problem inherently begins with this pipe, and until this pipe is upgraded, we're not going to touch it with 10-foot pole because we don't want to be the last ones touching it. So this is partially through our construction. We've got this inlet cage to protect the inlet of the pipe, which is really a backup. So if the beaver actually does a fair amount of work and starts clogging the primary cage, you've got this secondary inlet to help flow continue through, so that you have that time buffer to get in there and maintain, pull that material out before it causes problems on the road. This is what it looked like in the end. We've got these kind of H braces keeping the pipe down. There's also concrete blocks ballasting the pipe. The pipe is perforated with holes so that it doesn't collect too much air bubbles. It's got a little bit of a pitch so water flows down it. If this starts to clog up, you'll see we actually did protect the backside of the cage where the pipe comes out of the road embankment, because beavers are crafty and they'll climb from the road and plug you from behind. These are materialists. We spent about $4,500 on this structure. A whole bunch of labor from the Northwood Stewardship Center went into making this. This is a assembled cage. We build the cage on the ground. We drive posts. We build the cage on the high and dry. We walk in and it's got a floor so the beaver can't come up from underneath, right? And then we lay it in place. We drive posts in the corners, and then we brace those posts with a whole bunch of 2x4s. Really keep it in position. We want this thing to last through floods, through ice, through snowplow throw, through beavers, through the ornery neighbor who wants to take his backhoe and clean it out and hook a corner and maybe yank half of it out of the water. So we're trying to build them for resiliency, right? We want to get 5-10 years out of this thing. And the town of Albany has accepted the responsibility of maintaining it. We're inspecting it and keeping up with it for the first year to make sure we did our job correctly. And then they'll take it on. And we got them to sign up for 2. We approached them with 3 ideas. They said, let's try these 2. So the other one is on Uri Road, not too far down, same Seaver Brook. The funny thing is the river, this is the site right here. And the river actually goes all the way around, but during peak flows, it'll jump and come down this little wetland and kind of bypass. So it'll have this kind of hijacking short circuit. So this is where these culverts kind of get clogged up with both active plugging and just debris jams. So this is a big 7-acre wetland that we're trying to keep functioning, right? And it's got this 200-year-old goat path of a road going across it with 2 janky pipes that just keep getting clogged up. Fortunately, the pipes, they weren't too small per se. That one was clogged up when we were there in the summer. And so we actually focused on the primary pipe, the lower pipe, to protect. This one is kind of like a backup pipe. So it has its own built-in bypass that they were going to clean out for us. You can see they tried to block the debris, but like Tyler said, when there's just 2-foot diameter pipe to block, it's relatively easy to do in one night for a single beaver. So we tried to give it a little bit more of a deterrent. So here's Ted and Gabby taking our shots. And then this is the crew building the structure, first cage. So the cage has been assembled on the ground again, drop in place, drive those posts. An orchard ladder is a really handy tool to do this because they are just 3 legs, not 4. So you can maneuver them better, and they usually can go right over the cage, and you can use your sledgehammer to get the posts driven in. Northwoods did a great job building these for us. This is our pre-constructed inlet bypass pipe cage. So we essentially cut a hole through this, slid the culvert pipe into it, and then position them out in the lake or out in the pond. Again, just kind of secondary insurance policy here. And this has been a little bit of an inactive beaver dam for the last year, but it's been such a chronic problem that we decided, okay, if more debris starts coming down in the floods, it'll still serve the same purpose, whether or not beavers are actually actively doing it on their own. So we've got a landowner, Earl Mayer in Albany, who is very diligent about keeping eyes on these projects for us. He's going to be on the horn if they ever need maintenance during this first year, and then we can report back to town and say, hey, so far so good. You guys are on the hook for keeping up with this. If you need any assistance, let us know. And then we did 3 projects this summer with the funding that we got last December or last January. This last one is on Darling Hill Road. If you've ever done the Memphremagog ski trail loop down Derby, Newport line area, right on the lake. This is also a vast crossing. So this is a large agricultural parcel. This is a really important confluence of 3 tributaries. We actually approached this landowner like 3 years ago and said, hey, this would be a perfect site for some beaver dam analogs. We would love to put in hand-built beaver dams along these ditches and streams because this is an old wetland and it was ditched and drained for haying and it's kind of reclaiming itself. We'd like to accelerate that process. They said, thanks, no thanks. We want to keep the farmer happy who pays our field. And so we said, okay, no problem. Fast forward 18 months, the beavers beat us to it, and they built this beautiful wetland. It's about a half a square mile. It's not a tiny stream, but barely perennial. And they built a half-acre beaver pond. They're getting into all of these popples, cottonwoods, aspens, willows over here, and they built this miraculous structure over there. So we really like this project because it's like half a mile from the lake, right? So this like direct tributary, fish are going up this tributary from the lake. There's resident brook trout in a couple of these a couple of the fingers. It's recreational, it's agricultural, it's residential, all of that kind of nexus conflict potential with a really elegant solution that we were trying to work towards to fix this conflict so that we didn't lose the trail, so that we didn't lose the snowmobile trail, so that we didn't lose any more hay field, and that's so we didn't lose the beavers. So this is a 4-foot tall beaver dam. There's the lodge right there. You can see its favorite snack over in the corner. The cool thing is they usually leave these big legacy pines because it's not worth their trouble. This was an 18-inch pipe. This was just like one little spillway of the dam, just like bypassing itself. And this spillway alone was too much for that pipe at times. Never mind 2 other streams coming in, and the whole dam, if it ever gave way, would completely overwhelm this pipe. It had already kind of been undermined and blasted out through the floods. So we looked at it and we were like, okay, maybe we can do some sort of beaver baffle in the dam to manage the level. It's like, well, that doesn't stop the fact that the pipe is too small. Or maybe we could put an inlet protection cage around the front so it doesn't get clogged. Well, it doesn't change the fact that the pipe is too small. So we just said the pipe has to go. So we took the pipe out, and we got the Drift Duster Snowmobile Club in Derby, who is responsible for maintaining this trail, to find lying around a 24-foot long bridge that was 7 feet wide that used to be for an ATV trail. And we talked with them, and they said, well, usually we need bridges to pass our groomer, which is 14 feet or 11 feet wide and 14,000 pounds. And they said, but you know what? We barely ever get snow far enough from here to the lake to actually warrant grooming. Half the time we have to turn around. And so they said, we're just going to stop grooming at the bridge, and you guys can keep maintaining the bike trail, and the snowmobiles can keep going, but we don't need to get our groomer across. So Kingdom Lawn Care, Brandon over there was really fantastic. He got us this bridge. He brought it over. We bought some concrete blocks and some decking, and we built now 24-foot bridge over what was an 18-inch pipe with 16-foot ramp. So this thing is a beauty on a mountain bike. It's going to be a huge jump on a snowmobile. But the beaver are not going to mess with this channel any more than they would downstream further. Like, this is not this tiny little conduit that all they have to do is spend a half an evening plugging and they get their benefit from it. This is going to take a lot more effort. They're not going to mess with this any more than they would half a mile downstream. And we get our passage, we get our recreation, we get, you know, no more conflict with the trail users or the farmer who needs to cross this. So Northwoods is coming back. We got one more day of Northwoods labor. We're going to put a railing on this bridge at the end of this week. But it's been open for over a month. It's been working. The beavers are still happy. We'll see how long they live there, because they're going to eat themselves out of house and home probably by the end of this year and move on. So we didn't want to sink a bunch of money into this structure that really served no long-term purpose. Gabby's going to tell you about beaver dam analogs.
Patrick mentioned in the last slide that we were interested in putting beaver dam analogs up in this wetland and trying to, you know, mimic what these actual beaver dams actually do. That's what they are. They're a form of tech process-based restoration, just a fancy way of saying they are beaver dams that people construct. We don't, you know, we try our best to build them as structurally sound as a beaver does, but we're not out there on the landscape constantly patching these up. So we try our best. They do really great things. We hone in on building these structures and habitats that are degraded, streams that are incised, and typically on areas that are drained, ditches on agricultural land. So what we want to do is try to slow, sink, and spread out water that's coming through that landscape by slowing down the water and the velocity. It's decreasing the amount of, you know, force that the water is coming through and driving erosion down further into the landscape, disconnecting it from its floodplain. So that allows that slowing process to drop out any sediments or nutrients in those areas, slowing that water down. Also, and having that physical barrier of the dam allows the water to spread out onto its floodplain, dropping out some of those sediments and materials that are flushing down through the system and at those high flood events. It also provides stream bank stability on erosive incised stream banks, and then creates all this amazing habitat that Tyler had mentioned. You know, we're creating back-flowing waters, we're creating habitat for fish, birds. We tend to see a lot of herons fishing off of our beaver dam structures, which is really awesome, and plenty of frogs actually occupy these spaces as well. So they're built using the wood on the landscape. We like to try to harvest what is available if we can. If there's a nice forest nearby on the property that we're allowed to harvest from, then we'll do that. We'll cut down some trees that are pretty regenerative, and trying to target things like willows that we can use to weave in between these structures to sprout and grow into the structures and provide stability too. So we're harvesting this wood from the area. We're creating posts, pointed posts about this deep, you know, and then driving them into the stream bank, across into the stream banks, and then into the channel and up onto the other side. You can kind of see that here. So this is the stream bank. Here's another stream bank. We're kind of driving them into the bottom of the substrate. And then we're taking all of these smaller twigs, branches, conifer boughs, willow branches, and weaving those in between to create that really tight structure. Having those fine conifer boughs really creates more surface area to slow that water down. And while we're weaving things in, kind of creating like a basket going from both sides and seeing where the holes are and kind of stepping down on the structure itself to push down all of those branches. And then we're doing that same thing over and over again. We're also digging out sod, native sod from the stream banks and out onto the floodplain to patch into the actual structure themselves, kind of like beavers put mud and pat it down and push it into the structure. We're trying to take a note from their book and do the same thing. And while we're using that native sod, we're actually having those plants grow into the structure themselves as well. It kind of helps us with that long-term maintenance plan because we're not out here constantly patching holes when they hear the water, you know. So we try our best to mimic those types of methods that they have. And then we also, if the structure is pretty tall and creating a waterfall on the other side, we'll be thoughtful to put down conifer branches and stuff on the other side to break that fall so it doesn't start eroding down on the opposite side. So this is kind of a little picture of what the structure looks like. Most times we'll do a row of 2 posts and then weave in between those. And then we're shoving more material in there. There'd be more branches, conifer boughs, leaves, and just crunching it down there, weaving more stuff in there. And then on the top, we'll get a really big log, which is called like a ballast log, and we'll shove it down in between the posts to create that tension. And that kind of creates, doesn't allow for the materials to kind of float away if the water's really high and flushing through the system. It creates that nice tension to keep everything down.
It's slow.
Yeah. All right. So here's some awesome photos of one of our first projects that I was a part of with Beaver Dam Analogs installation. So here's a picture of Northwood Stewardship Center coming out before we installed these structures to harvest a bunch of materials. Look how giant these trees are we're pulling out and processing them down to stakes and smaller branches and whatnot, and kind of staging the site like that. And then we're getting into the stream. Normally we work at the downstream end and then work our way up. So you can see here's a structure being built and a few other ones being staged or built behind. Like the beavers, we try to build these structures in series to have the increased structural support of one beaver dam being behind another and having that water flow up and out, and then do the same thing down below as well. So here's a few examples on these tributaries, and here's another series of them. Here's a beautiful shot there. Yeah.
Ultimately, do you end up having to degrade some of these over time when they get really dense and get willows growing in there? The idea is you want to have flow through them, right?
Yeah, so these are leaky structures. They do rack up material when a big storm comes through. Sometimes they'll catch material from other beaver dams or just from the wood, like a stream flowing through a forest up slope. They'll take up all those materials. We want them to be trapped. We're not really going out and cleaning out the materials because they're doing its job. If it completely plugs with sediment and it's creating channels out to the side and breaching the dam itself, great. Getting water out onto the floodplain. We're creating a more dynamic, sinuous stream instead of it being a ditch straight channel kind of going straight through. So we're kind of introducing that opportunity for meanders and for capturing sediments and slowing that water down for all those great benefits that I mentioned before. But great question. Yeah, we definitely, a lot of these structures are racking up materials after these giant floods. We have a good picture of that. So some of the streams that are targeted for BDAs are ditched integrated channels. A lot are on ag fields that have been channelized to get the water off the property, or to unfortunately drain some of the property so they can have more area to hay or to have productive lands. Again, size channels, meaning that the channel is completely, dropped down pretty far, like 2 feet or so, and the water doesn't really have a chance to get up onto this lovely floodplain. And then streams that are lacking wood or a wood replenishing. So, this area is completely devoid from wood. Wood gets probably stuck up here and then it doesn't really come through this low gradient stream. So wherever we can see there's a lack of wood, we try to add it to create complexity. Wood tends to be those bones and that structure that a stream really needs to create a more complex, happy habitat. Here's a great project. All those pictures that I showed you were from this project site, Valley Brook Stream Management Area. You can see this map has a bunch of stuff going on, but I want you to check out these channels. There's a bunch of brown blobs on each of these channels. Here's another one, brown blobs. Oh, it's this huge slew of brown blobs. These are all beaver dam analogs. We installed 35 beaver dam analogs across 5 degraded ditch streams out in Morgan, Vermont, on the old Farrow farm as a part of a huge effort to restore floodplain and stream bank habitat across a huge old, dairy farm that was previously decommissioned. So we went in and threw a bunch of wood at these streams, and they are working and thriving. So here's Patrick with some of the Northwoods members and checking out some of these structures and talking about how they actually function. And then there's them getting in the thick of it, being beavers, growing their tails out and their teeth out, having a great time. It rained almost like every day, but they were cheery and got through it. It was great. One of the best things about installing these projects is seeing people see the function of these structures. You know, you're digging out a hole next to the structure on the floodplain that's 3 feet above the bottom of the channel, and it's already starting to fill up with water as you're building water or building a structure that's filling up with water. So you can see that the water is soaking into the floodplain and filling up with water. So it's nice to have that visual context to be like, wow, it's happening. You know, it's putting water into the floodplain. It's soaking up like a sponge almost and holding it longer. And it's instead of rushing through the system, causing havoc further downstream.
Gabby?
Yeah.
Will the beavers, will they use the artificial dams so that they get their boat?
Yeah. So I've heard that can be an instance of that happening. I haven't seen it, but we are hopeful that these structures will invite beavers and want, as we plant more food for them, maybe they'll come in and utilize those structures and build their own structures and help us maintain those structures would be really great too, because we only have so yeah, great question. So we always hope that they will come and use our structures, even though they're not as adequate as they would probably build them. And then here's a good shot of that same project site, Valley Brook Stream Bank Management Area, after being hit with this past July flood in 2024. You can see this immense amount of sediment behind it. It's a whole, I'm sure it's the whole Valley Road and Valley Brook above it, just kind of washing out down. You can see this, the height between the bottom of the channel and the top of the structure here. I remember getting out here with Patrick, and he's like, man, these are some beefy structures for a small like drainage culvert coming through. And I was like, I don't know, we'll see. And here we are, totally loaded to the top. You can see that same piece of ballast wood already up to the top of the sediment here. So they work, they do their job. And if this wasn't here, all of this material would be in Lake Seymour. So it's doing its job, thank goodness. We also were able to install BDAs at Willoughby Falls, that should be Falls, Wildlife Management Restoration, or Wildlife Management Area. It's a restoration project that Patrick was able to install. They got 14 beaver dam analogs along the Barton River. There's a ditch floodplain that they used to drain the floodplain so they could hay it. I believe haying was the thing that they were doing out there, but it was still a very soggy mess. I can't believe they tried to pay them. So what we wanted to do was put more BDAs in, restore that wetland hydrology, and trap some sediment off of these smaller channels here. You can see a map here of just the series of BDAs along each section of the ditch. And there's Pete Emerson, fisheries biologist, with Patrick Hurley. And then we also have some funding to monitor these BDAs, which is really cool. We get to have some lessons learned. We understand that these things aren't forever, but we can hope for the best, because when we build these structures, you can see, we put these willow whips in there and they are already growing in, and they're creating a stabilized structure for our structures themselves. And, we've learned a lot that every single piece of wood that we put on any channel, no matter how big the piece of wood is and how small the channel is, we need to make sure we pin it down so the waters don't take it away. Wood floats, So that's a really great lesson we learned there. So we rebuilt some structures that were washed out, and now they're functioning properly and pinned down and doing great. We have a few other PDA installation projects that we're going for right now. We're in the design process for a project off of the Clyde Street that flow on a tributary that flows to the Clyde River. Here is a picture or a map of the stream. All these black areas, except this one. Don't look at that one. We are putting in wood installations of beaver dam analogs, large woody additions as well, and then post-assisted log structures. These are all just different types of wood that we're putting in the stream to access the floodplain better, to slow water down, have all those great ecosystem functions that come along with it. So here's that channel that's pretty incised, and we want water to be accessing this. This actually used to be an old remnant beaver dam meadow. The beavers probably ate themselves out of house and home. Phragmites came in because there's a lot of management of these corridors and totally took over the area. So we're trying to come in here and restore those habitats, put some more wood in there. Hopefully beavers will come back in for us. And here's another project we're working with the Orleans NRCD with Ted. Actually, this is his project off of Palin Farm Road. It's a stream and floodplain restoration design project. We're looking to put wood all along the stream, planting it with a bunch of native trees as well, creating that awesome habitat, getting water out of that incised channel and out on the floodplain. So yeah, very fun. Patrick?
Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for coming. I hope it was beneficial and you enjoyed it. We'll be doing another one in April, I think.
Yep.
Anyone has any ideas of what they'd like to do now besides what we're doing? And if you like what we're doing,
And if you have any beaver questions, you know where to find us.
Yeah, just let me know.
Thanks, everybody.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Good to see you.
Awesome.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. This is great.
I love how you're already anticipating, like, I have flowers.
That comes from years back.